Hello everyone, welcome back to part 2 of creating plants and trees and everything that comes with leaves or branches pretty much in Blender. It is a procedural geometry node setup, so we can use it for whatever you want. In this part we're going to focus more on adding some thickness and adding some randomness to the branches, and it may all just be a little bit more difficult than we anticipated because it all has to be dependent and stay procedural. So let's dive in. So something like this looks quite decent, I would say. Let's delete the drawings there. And what I want to do now as well is, let's add this in here. I want to be able to control the length of the spline compared to the position on its original branch, right? Which means I want those bottom branches to be longer and the top branches, the sub branches, to be a little bit shorter, right? So how do we control that? Well, it's not that hard actually, because we are going to be able to set our spline length, right? We can actually set our length of our spline with either a trim curve or a scale. Where is it? The scale of the instance. So we can actually trim this based on our input curve. So to do that, we can actually just use another spline parameter, another information about the curve length, right? The curve factor. And to do that, we need to capture that right at the start. And the reason why is because if we would just add a spline parameter here without capturing it at the start, it's going to capture the factor of the sub branches, right? And that is not something we want to be able to use for the spline length. Okay, we want to be controlling the spline length based on our original curve position, right? So the 0 position needs to have the longest curves. The 1 position of our original curve needs to have the shortest sub branches. So I'm going to capture that factor right at the start there. So Shift A, capture attribute, or we could even do a store named attribute there. And I'm going to set this to be a float, it's fine. And the value is going to be the spline parameter. There we go. The name I'm going to use is OG spline, right? Our original spline. And that is a value we can now just reuse whenever we need it. Okay. And what I want to do is, before we use this, is I want to invert our factor, right? Because this is now going from, if our draw, this point is going to be 0, and this point is going to be 1. Beautiful one. And I want this to be the inverse, right? Because we're going to be scaling our sub branches, right? Our branches that are now sideways. We're going to scale that with that factor, which means that I want the bottom to be 1, right? A size of 1, and the top to be 0, a size of 0. So I want to invert that, and I'm going to do that right before we store it. So Shift A, map range, and we can set this from 0 to 1 to 1 to 0, right? And that's basically an inverted spline parameter. Beautiful. Now, OG spline is the name, so we are going to drag the resample a bit to the right, and we want another trim curve, right? So set this to 1. This is the default setting, and we want the endpoint, the end trim of the curve, to be defined by that attribute we just created. So drag that out to a named attribute and type in OG spline. There we go. So right now, the bottom is going to be the longest and the top is going to be 0. Beautiful. And we can control that quite easily. And to do that, right now, that is going to be a straight line from 0 to 1. And we can actually control it a little bit better, right? So if I just drag this out here, beautiful, and hit Shift A and find a float curve, we can actually do all sorts of stuff with this, right? So if I want to have more or longer branches a bit more to the middle as well, so this point, we could just make this a little bit more rounded there. All right, beautiful. All right, so I think something like this already looks quite decent. I'm gonna crank up my number of branches a little bit, the branch count. Let's set this to 20. There we go. So now it's looking quite decent, and we can actually see how it's being shaped up. All right. So what do we do next? Well, I want to have a little bit of randomness in my sub-branching, right? I don't want it to be completely straight, I want some noise there. So what I'm gonna do is, right before we set that gravity, I'm gonna add a little bit of noise instead, right? So we want another set position, duplicate that, and the offset is going to be a noise texture. Now right away, this is gonna look terrible, so make sure to first connect the color instead of the vector, Shift A, and find vector math. that's not the right one, vector math. And whenever we add a noise texture into a vector input, we generally need to subtract 0.5, right? Just something you need to remember to replace it to its original position. And I would usually set the detail right to 0 and the noise texture scale a bit lower. Now, right away, you can see that this is not really doing what we need because it's also moving the starting points of those sub-branches. So right away, we're going to add another vector math there and set that to scale. And we, once again, want to scale those endpoints with 0, or sorry, the start points with 0 and the endpoints with 1, right? So we don't want any noise displacement where they attach to the main curve, but we want to have noise the more it moves away from that branch, right? From the original branch. And that is something we can just use a spline parameter for, right? So just drag this out, spline parameter, and there we go. Beautiful. Right away, it works like a charm. Now, if this is too strong for you, just duplicate your scale. There we go, and set this to be a little bit lower. All right, something like that. Maybe a bit more scale in the noise, so we can actually see some stuff going on there. That's looking quite decent, right? Amazing. So we already have our original system set up quite nicely. Okay, so what do we do next? Well, we need to convert this to a mesh if we want to have some kind of thickness to our curves, right? And that's very easy to do actually. So what we do is Shift A and find a curve to mesh, right? And we want that in the main curve, and we also want that in the subcurve. Okay, there we go. And for the profile, I'm not going to use a curved circle, which will be the obvious pick. I'm going to use a spiral, and I will explain why right away. So instead of a circle, we use a spiral for a very simple reason. If we want to UV unwrap this, if we want to apply any type of bark or wood texture to this, or whatever material you would like, then we need a proper UV map, okay? And to do that, we need to unwrap this in the geometry nodes, which can be a little bit of an issue, but it's not completely undoable at all. So the reason why we use a spiral is, let me just set this to be a little bit easier. One rotation. There we go. The reason why we use a spiral is because, let me move this down. And let me just set this all to 0.03. There we go. And let me set the height to 0, right? Beautiful. The reason why is because right now you can see that we have a little bit of a weird line going on here. And that is because a spiral has a start and an end point, right? So this is where the start of the spiral meets the end. Okay, so if I go into my wireframe, you can't really see what's happening, but this line right here is where they would meet up and, well, connect. Okay, so if we have a circle, it wouldn't have a start or an end point, and that's really hard to unwrap by Blender, right? Because usually a UV map needs a start and an end point in both of its axis, right? X and Y. So to do that, we use a spiral. Very easy. I'm going to set a resolution to like 5. That's fine. And then what I want to do to unwrap this, we need 2 values, right? We know that the UV map is 2D, right? A 2D UV map, and it goes, well, like this. This is the X usually, this is the Y. And to unwrap this, we need the X and a Y value. Right, and we know that we have one value that goes along the curve, that is the spline parameter, right? We know that the top is 1, the bottom is 0. So Blender has the information of that direction of the curve from 0 to 1, which can be our X direction. And the other direction is going to be the profile of our curve, right? So if we would unwrap a circle like this, and this will be our intersection points that we have right now, the spiral. And if we unwrap that, you're going to get a line, right? Imagine you have a little A4 paper that you roll up into a circle, a cylinder. You unwrap that, you unroll that, you'll end up with a 2D plane, right? A square. And that is what happens here as well. It turns into a line, right? Look at your A4 paper from the side. It has almost 0 thickness, so it's almost 2D, okay? So that is what happens. So that is going to be our Y. Right, 0 to 1 in Y. Beautiful. So what do we need for that? What do we do in geometry nodes? I'm going to erase this real quick. we need for the spiral and for our original curve, right? So this is a curve, our spiral, and this is our curve, our original curve. We need two things, okay? So our spiral, I'm gonna collapse that for a sec. Let's hit Shift A, and we need to capture an attribute for our curve and capture an attribute for our, well, profile curve. Reason why is, of course, X and Y value. So for our original curve, I just told you it's going to be a spline parameter. There we go, for the factor 0 to 1. The same factor is going to be for the spiral, and the spiral has an actual start and end point, which means our factor is 0 to 1, and it actually makes sense, right? For a circle, it will be much harder for Blender to get it right. So that is beautiful. Now we want to store these values in a vector, because a UV map is actually a vector, because we do need an X and a Y axis. So we're gonna just combine our X, combine X, Y, Z, with our Y value of the profile curve. There we go. And we're gonna store our combined X, Y, Z, Shift A, store named attribute, after we turn it to a mesh, right? So that is beautiful. And then just connect this up to our value, or well, we should set this to a vector first and then connect it up. And let's name this store UV, right? So what this does is after we turn it to a mesh, it is storing our X and Y value for our map, right? For our UV map. Beautiful. Now, of course, we do have a start and an end position, which means that it's not going to be able to shade this smooth right now. So just Shift A, merge by distance right after we store that value, right? So it stores the value and then it connects it up. Beautiful. So that is that done, right? So don't worry about accessing that yet in the materials. We'll get to that later. First, I want to set the value of our radius properly right away. So Shift A, right there at the point before we turn it to a mesh. Right there. Let's do it where we have some room. It doesn't matter if we do it before or after the capture attributes. Shift A, set curve radius. There we go. And the curve radius is able to set the radius for the curve at specific points of the curve, right? So 0.05 is quite small. Crank it up a little bit, you'll see the radius appear. So now we are able to control the radius for specific points on the curve. And to do that, right, I want this top to be closed and small, and the bottom can be bigger, thicker. So drag this out to a spline parameter once again. The factor, right? 0 to 1, 0 radius, 1 radius. Flip that around with a map range. There we go, from 0 to 1 to 1 to 0. And now our endpoints are actually 0 and our start is 1. Quite easy. So we want the same kind of setup for our subcurves, right? So I'm not just gonna do the exact same steps. What I'm gonna do is just group everything up here, right? Because this is everything we need to turn this into a actual mesh, right? And Control G, this is now a group, right? So for the input of that group, there's one thing I want more than all, and that is a little bit of a radius, right? So one thing I can control the radius for the subcurves compared to my original spline. To do that, right, we set the curve radius here. So I'm just going to hit Shift A and find a math node and set this to be a multiply. There we go. Value of 1 is going to be our standard value, but this value is going to be able to control. All right, so drag that into the input. And is there anything else we need? Not really. And right away, for every group of this we add, we will have it unwrapped in a store UV map. Beautiful, right? Exit this, or let's just name this to radius, right? Our input value there, and exit the group. Now we have one group that we can call set radius, or convert to mesh and UV unwrap. Beautiful. Gonna make this a bit bigger so we know what it says. There we go. And now the radius is something we can control quite easily, right? So I'm gonna Shift D that and add it to the bottom part as well, right? Just add it there and Control X that other one. We don't need that. Beautiful. Now there's just one issue. You can see that the top parts of this curve, right? The top parts of our subcurves are not scaled together with our original radius, right? Original curve radius, which is annoying, a little bit annoying, right? So what we can do instead is we already captured our original spline parameter, right? From 0 to 1, and we can just reuse that, right? Now let's think about this for a sec, right? We already have our factor, 0 to 1. We changed that from 1 to 0, which is perfect. And we added a little bit of a float curve. So is the float curve something we need there? Let's see how it looks, right? So let's just access the same exact thing. And to do that, we need to scale our radius with a specific value, right? And right now we can't really access that from outside of our group. So I'm going to go inside of our group, right? Edit group. I'm just going to add another multiply node in front of our set curve radius there, right? And we just want this to be an input, something that we can control. And I'm going to name this spline dependent radius, I guess, you know, exit the group. And now we have another value that we can actually control. And I want the radius for my sub branches to actually be controlled by our, the position on my original curve, right? So drag that out to a named attribute. And a named attribute is going to be OG spline. There we go. And right away you can see beautifully what happens, right? At the top, our branches are incredibly thin. At the bottom, they are a little bit thicker. Now, it's a bit too thick, so let's crank this down just a little bit to like 0.8. Beautiful. Right, so that was quite easy now, wasn't it? So we have branches that actually match with the main branch beautifully. All right, so what else do we want to do? We want to add some leaves. Do we want to add a third layer of branches is the real question here. Do we? I think we do. Right, and it's actually not that hard to do. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add, let's actually just make this a little bit more beautiful first, right? Because I can imagine it's getting a little bit chaotic. So this is going to be another group that, let's mute this. What does it do? It adds a little bit of noise, right? So Ctrl J, add noise, there we go. So gravity, add noise, there we go. Beautiful. All right. And this is, of course, well, it belongs to the add noise. There we go. Amazing. And this is going to be, of course, the branch gravity node. We can actually add that in there, I guess. Beautiful. And then we send it to the convert to mesh and unwrap. Okay, so it is quite clean now, I guess. And these value, this is basically just a little bit of a random trim. So we can name that random length. Beautiful. And this, of course, actually, let's just add that in there, right? Beautiful. Okay, so hopefully it is still manageable for you guys to read that. Okay, now a rotation value is inside the branch gravity for some reason. So just right mouse that and remove that from frame, right? So this is going to be our rotation value, branch gravity. There we go. And let's make this a bit more of a chronological order, just like that. Okay, that makes sense, right? So now we can actually follow this chronologically. Whoa, what a difficult word to say. All right, so start. We add new sub branches. We set the rotation there at the bottom. Then we set a random length for each of the branches. We add a little bit of noise to the position. And then we add a little bit of gravity to the branches. And then, of course, we convert it to a mesh and UV unwrap it right away. Amazing. All right. That was part 2 of the Plants and Trees series, right? We're creating a nice procedural setup. We just added that little group that adds branches. So we'll be able to reuse that for a third level of branches in the next part. If you like this video, please leave a like, a comment, subscribe. Any one of those will make me incredibly happy. And then I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.